All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Higher Alignment Podcast. And I'm actually really excited for today's episode because I have Gilbert Bong on with us today, which is amazing. But I'm excited because we actually met on LinkedIn, and I was thinking about this earlier about how just the nature of connections these days is happening online so much more and more, and how it's great in a lot of ways because you're getting exposed to people that you'd never cross paths with and just the amount of conversation that can open up from it. So thank you, Gilbert, for being here today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this episode. It should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know, well, you may or may not, Gilbert is actually one of the co-hosts of the Between Two Dots podcast. So please check it out if you haven't. I was fortunate enough to be a guest on there a couple of weeks ago. But maybe, Gilbert, we could start off with just a little bit about your background. I know you live in Calgary. I think you told me you were born and raised there, but maybe just a little bit about your growing up situation and what's going on in life now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, born and raised in Calgary, that is true, to immigrant parents. They came over from Malaysia, and I originally grew up in the northeast quadrant, which is kind of like a typically characterized by more ethnic and lower income part of the city, and had a you know I would say average income household, and went to the University of Calgary, took finance and risk and insurance management, and found my way into the world of finance in a whole host of different ways. So at this point, my career had largely previously been focused on corporate advisory and capital markets, but now I've found my way to wealth management. So I'm a recovering investment banker, as I like to say.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know when you and I had chatted last, I was kind of mentioning I wanted to make the theme of today's episode about taking risks. Because you had asked me on the episode you had me on, what would I tell my younger self? And then I reversed that question back to you, and you said it would be to take more risks. So just kind of jumping into what you said. So you went to school for finance, and then was it a seamless process of falling into that industry? Did you ever have moments of like, do I want to do this? Like, because I always think about the fact that we expect kids really to start figuring out their life so young. You know, when we think about it, like we graduate at 18, we get thrown into like a big investment as far as post-secondary, and it's like figure it out now. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? So for you, was it like you knew as soon as you were doing it that this is what you wanted to do? Was there any doubt at any point?
Yeah, I think at going through university at first, I didn't even know what investment banking was. So it was something that was started to be talked about as an aspirational career. And so once I learned a little bit more about it, it did sound interesting, but also compounding with the fact that there was a lot of people scrambling to kind of get into investment banking careers, made it all the more attractive. In certain respects, I think for I got average grades. I wouldn't say I was like a great student, but the fact that a lot of people wanted to get into the industry and it seemed competitive made it attractive for me to just strive for. It's not like I think it just goes back with, as you're kind of growing up, you don't necessarily have the confidence that your older self does, or maybe you just kind of learn to shed um, the requirement to have the approval of different people. But I certainly was younger, and the external validation did mean something to me. So I saw that as an opportunity to gain status and prestige as well. I had heard that the money was good as well, but that's I guess we'll go through that discussion. But inevitably, money is not everything. So that's
I,
the path I took, though.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on that because like my clientele and people who listen to this podcast are mainly, pretty driven and ambitious people. And I always talk about the fact that like kind of in our 20s it typically is based on more external drivers. You know what I mean? Because we're kind of fresh out the womb. We don't really know much about the world yet, right? So there is the allure of the money and the accolades and the lifestyle and the achievements, you know what I mean? And not that those don't still have merit as you get older, but I've found, because I mainly deal with people who are dealing with burnout, typically in their mid 30s plus, and I found that like for the first 10 years of your career, those external accolades are enough to kind of get you going. And then just like you mentioned, eventually you get to a point where you're like, well, the money isn't quite enough, right, to make me happy. Of course, it's great to have some security and feel like you can take care of yourself and your family. Of course, that's obviously very important. But you realize that there's got to be more like intrinsic value as well. Like there's got to be something inside that really keeps you going. So for you, I guess, did you go through that transition, or when did you have that realization of like what was originally driving you in this career maybe started to shift as far as what the motivators were? Or maybe they are the same and that's okay too.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like with my chosen career path, and this probably weaves into our discussion on risk. It was it was as I mentioned, highly competitive. It was a hustle in the sense that, when you start out in the industry, you're working like 90 to 100 hours a week. So it is hard, both mentally as well as physically. And comparatively, I remember when I first started in the industry, I had a coworker who didn't last too long in the industry, but he would, at the end of the day, calculate his hourly wage based on off the number of hours that we worked, and that was never like a great, uh, you know, piece of information to have, because sometimes you just don't want to know, right?
Right.
But it was also a very safe career in a lot of ways, in the sense that you could kind of look all the way up the chain of command and understand what your career could look like 5, 10, 15 years into the future. And I worked with some very switched on, smart, exceptional people. Some of them are friends and mentors, but it also left something to imagination. Like inevitably, you kind of knew the types of activities that you were going to be involved in. Maybe the people would change, maybe the deals would change, but ultimately you kind of knew the path and the trajectory, plus or minus several years, to kind of get to a certain level and a certain pay grade and that sort of stuff. So I did have an inkling to seek something different, something a little bit more entrepreneurial, but I didn't know what that was during the tail end of my last stint, which was at a major Canadian bank. And inevitably, the uh, fortune had it was the oil and gas industry, which is the primary industry that was covered in Calgary, in terms of investment banking, had a downturn. Commodity prices started to go down, and there was mass layoffs at all the oil and gas companies. So my particular firm did a restructuring, and so I got a package that came out of that. And I believed at the time I could have just gone, call it the safer route, into another energy investment banking role, but I did want to try something a little bit more entrepreneurial, and that inevitably kicked off the second half of my career in what would eventually become my our firm's wealth management focus.
Mm. Can I ask you like how old you were when that happened? Like that transition, or how long ago that was?
So we've had the company for almost 9 years. I'm going to be turning, well, I'm 41 now, so so yeah, I guess early 30s or whatever. Is that,
Okay.
hopefully I did the math right there.
Yeah, it sounds right to me. Two Asians trying to subtract 9 from 41. So,
Yeah.
um, okay. Well, I love that you shared that, and the reason I want to maybe ask some more questions in that area is, again with that topic of taking risks, I find that the older we get, the more difficult that can become a little bit. Because I think just natural human tendencies, you kind of just get set in your ways. Your brain adjusts to a certain understanding of life and what quote unquote security is and what risk is. Your body sets into that. Like aside from just like the mindset, there's a very physical aspect to what people equate to as risky or safe, and it varies per human, right? Like something that might be more risky to you might be, I'm like, oh, I could do that in my sleep, vice versa. So and the reason I love that you brought this up is I actually have worked with a couple clients who are at that point as well too, kind of late 30s, and they got a payout, and they're at this point where we're like, they're like, what am I doing next? And like, I don't want to repeat the same patterns I had in my old career with whatever I choose to do next, mainly because, again, we're at the point of dealing with burnout with me. But maybe you could walk us through what that process was like for you, if you're open to it, as far as like from a mental and emotional place, as far as getting the payout. Like we all know that, that's not necessarily a reflection of your work, but I'm sure, and I've talked to my client before, is there's a little bit of a story sometimes that goes on within your head, as like I got the payout, what does that really say about me, you know what I mean, and some doubt that may come along with that. So what was that like for you? And then what was the process of to deciding like, no, I'm actually going to go all in on starting a business and becoming an entrepreneur? Because I'll be honest, I think sometimes the entrepreneurial life is pretty glorified, but it sometimes you're working more than you were as an employee, you know?
Yeah, yeah, you'll have those like on the bathroom floor crying type moments and that sort of stuff. But
Totally. I had one last night, to be honest. So
okay, well, you look great, so
oh, thanks.
um, I think it's important to maybe step back a little bit and define and talk about what is risk. In my mind, risk largely boils down to uncertainty, and inevitably, it's so interesting how life is set up, where there are these competing forces and almost opposite forces as that. Like people want that certainty and stability, but they also want to be surprised and they want that unpredictability. We want um, we 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 want happiness, but we want some drama sometimes. Like people are just very complex, right? And so how I think about risks is we take risks every single day. Like there is nothing that is promised in terms of what is going to occur. Like every time we step into our car, every time we step into the street, you never know. And in terms of thinking about risk as uncertainty, the way that I think about risk is everyone is effectively managing this all the time. They're figuring out what to do, how to do it. And the way that I think makes sense in my mind is you you have to take risks because anything that is worth it comes from taking risks. Anything that is going to make a step change in your life or whatever the case, you need to take that risk. However, what you can do to the degree possible is mitigate those risks and try to make those uncertainties more certain, or have backstops to um, cover you off in the worst case scenario. So going back to that moment where I did let go, I was let go. This was the second time that I've been in that position. So at this point, I was an expert at it. Uh, it to be honest, like I said, it is that mental game because you never it never feels good, even though in some ways it may be what you wanted. So in this instance, as I mentioned, the tail end of my career with the bank, I actually was envisioning doing something more entrepreneurial and effectively getting that package, which covered me off for about a year, um, including bonus, provided that little bit of a backstop or a jumping board to go to the next thing. So inevitably, you always ask the questions, like why me, why now, and all those things. And you could ruminate. But I at that point had experienced it once before, and in hindsight, at least had the example that there was better things to come, or better in different respects, but different in all respects. So I was prepared for the next step mentally to a certain degree, and inevitably that piece of advice that I had offered when I asked you on our podcast is I would have taken risks earlier on, because the biggest factor, whether you're studying in finance or life just generally speaking, is the time frame. So given your time frame, if you have a longer time frame, you're able to take more risks. And statistically speaking, I was in my early 30s. At that point, my wife and I had not had kids yet. So there was less risk from obligations and financial responsibility perspective to try something different and try something new and build something out of nothing. So at that point, I deemed it appropriate that, why not take a shot at the can? Because uh, inevitably, I never want to be in that position looking back and wondering what if. Because the worst case scenario is it doesn't work out. I could get another job. I'm educated. I have certain level of transferable skills, and life goes on. So thinking thinking about the worst case scenario as well also helps in helping navigate risks, in my opinion and in my experience.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because sometimes, and again, something I had to say to myself last night when I was having my little moment, it's kind of like, what is the worst case scenario? And often the worst case scenario is you're like, I'm just back where I am right now. You know what I mean? Most of the time, depending. Um, but I love what you said about the risks and the unknown. And it's just like trying to make the unknown, how did you say it? You're like trying to make as much as or make the uncertainty as certain as possible. How did you say it again?
Yeah, I guess mitigating that risk and
Right.
making some trying to make the unknown or uncertain more certain, or covering yourself in often the worst case scenario.
Right, right. And I want to touch on that a little bit because I think like the majority of the time the unknown is it's really just in our head. It's not even so much about the unknown of what's happening in the world. It's we create so many scenarios and possible stories and possible outcomes, which I know that's an element of like you want to minimize exposure, right? In case something goes wrong, you kind of want to like, okay, so if this happens, this happens, this happens, I kind of have an idea of what I need to do. So that there's obviously merit in that. But then, in the line of work that I do when it comes to burnout, what I often see is a lot of people who are high performers who are really good at their jobs, still doing that process of like overthinking each scenario in scenarios that they already know instinctively how to react, right? Like if they have the skill set, they have the tools to deal that with that on the fly if it pops up. But when the mental game starts to take over and you start to ruminate, where a lot of that burnout typically comes from is they're overthinking something they already know how to do and that they've proven time and time again that they're very capable of. That's why they're in the position they're in. But even 10, 15, 20 years later, it's like, why am I still wasting all this bandwidth on something I could do in my sleep? And it's just, I think it's really interesting as far as the human psyche and how that works. But my next question to you would be like, because obviously in wealth management, I'm sure that's what a lot of your conversations are about with your clients, right? Like, so we could do this or we could do this, and what's the risks associated with it? And just like you said, like we take a risk every day just by showing up in the world. And I always say to people, whatever path you choose, there's always going to be risks and there's always going to be a hard associated with it. So it's just like picking the one that's most in alignment with the life that you want, right?
Yeah.
But I'm curious if you like, whether it's with your clients or within life, I'm sure it's interchangeable. Like, do you have like kind of like a framework you walk people through when you're assessing, like, hey, is this the right investment for us, or is this the right choice for us, as far as that risk factor and how to process that, if it's the right risk for them to take or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about kind of some of the things that you touched on and what I think is like a helpful framework for that. But I can also walk you through as it relates to how we look at things from the investment management side from our perspective. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the Solomon paradox, but the first time that I had come across this was actually listening to an Alex Hormozy podcast, and the Solomon paradox is such that King Solomon had the ability to provide individuals fantastic advice that would change their lives and result in good fortune, etc. But he was not able to provide good advice to himself, as his personal situation was a little bit of a disaster. So it's interesting because an exercise that Alex Hormozy had started to do was to project 85-year-old version of himself to advise his current self. And in that separation, in that framework, he was able to provide himself great advice. And it does the reason for this is a couple of things. Is the fact that when you're in your personal situation, it becomes very emotional. Sometimes you know what to do. Inherently, you know what to do. Like that's what you said that a lot of your clients do. They know what to do, but the the thing that they have to do comes with some sort of uncomfortable displeasure, pain, and that is the holdup. That's what freezes them, right? So whenever you're in a position as a coach or a trusted advisor, inevitably part of this is asking the right questions, acting as a sounding board in order for your client to come to the conclusion themselves that they already know the answer to. So I think that's a great framework to apply. And so inevitably, as it relates to um, approaches to wealth management, like statistically speaking, it is impossible to pick the best investments on the best days and time the market. But what you want to do is diligence the systems and the processes that make the whole investment process run. So what I mean by that is when you're looking at a particular fund or a team, how long has the lead portfolio manager been in place? How much skin do they have in the game? Are they, you know, eating their own cooking? Are they do they have a material amount of their net worth invested in the fund that they're running that they want you to buy? Has there been a lot of turnover in uh, the company? Is there a succession plan in place? So kind of systematic things that are put in place, those risk mitigants that I kind of talked about to the best of your ability, because you can't control the uncontrollable, but what you can look at is the system to which decisions have been made that have resulted in positive outcomes in the past. And so really paying attention to those systems and the process is important in whether that's talking in finance or in life, just generally speaking.
Yeah. I love what you just said there. It reminds me of, I was listening to a podcast that Tony Robbins was on a couple months ago. And it was talking about, again, in business and life, just like what's gotten him so far is the study of patterns and just how everything runs in patterns. He's like, even like with the political situation right now, he's like, if you go back, I can't remember which presidents he used, but if you go back to this and you read what was going on at the time, it makes what's going on today like like nothing. He's like, and so if we learn to understand that there's patterns and seasons with everything, whether it be business or life, you then start to realize that maybe you're in winter, maybe you're in spring. And so then what does that call out of you, you know? And I know that that's really helped me a lot lately. And I'm sure there's an element of that again with your clients as far as just like on the wealth side of things or just emotionally or whatever, because I'm sure there's a lot of emotions involved as well with your clients because you know you're dealing with, I'm sure, some pretty big numbers there. So it's there's going to be a nature to that as well too. But when you can understand that, the thing about patterns is, I talk about this a lot in my line of work, is like the patterns can either serve you or they can hinder you, right? And I think the key is to identify, is the pattern in alignment again with whatever said goal is, or is it actually holding you back? And just like you said, whether you're a trusted advisor or a coach, whatever the case is, it's like having someone be able to like very logically lay out how that pattern is serving you right now or fitting into your life, and then doing it from like a non-emotional standpoint can really support people, and then deciding, okay, so is this actually a risk, or am I just so used to holding on to something from the past that I view it as a risk, but it's actually way more in alignment than the way I've been living, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting because I find and people have pointed to the fact that um, nature is like the visualization of patterns and things that we use on a regular basis in our jobs, in mathematics and science and everything like that. It's all kind of represented in nature. And earlier this year, I had the opportunity to take a wonderful family vacation to Australia. And we were just kind of north of Sydney, and we kind of visited a bunch of like beaches and rock pools up and down that coastal part of Australia. And I my friend who's a local had said that it's very very important when you're in the waves, you have to kind of swim with the waves, and the riptides, they're kind of pushing this way and that. So to your point, what you said before is sometimes trends and patterns can work for you or they can work against you, but you have to kind of go with the flow to a certain degree, right? So you can't you can't go head on. Like if you're trying to go this way and the wave is pushing you that way, you're not going to win. So the patterns do change, and just like the waves on a beach, sometimes they are big, sometimes they're small, sometimes they go left, sometimes they go right, and it's kind of like in life and seasons in life. Uh, things are always going to change, so that's always a constant. So sometimes you just have to wait for the right wave and take advantage of it as much as possible.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy, and I think that's one thing that's like always a fine line to kind of navigate, especially in business. I mean, again, just business life, whatever, of that, like, is it a push or is it a pull or is it a standstill? You know, and I know for me, that's always something I'm constantly learning. And again, I think it varies per person. I'm also a big believer in like, I think there's a difference in men and women as far as their ability to push and pull. I just naturally think men are more wired to be able to push a little bit more, but there's also something very, um, magnetic and divine about women and their ability to be. And I feel like as women in business, we kind of have to navigate that a little differently, because I know I tried to do it the way you guys do it for a long time, and I had a lot of success, but it really burnt me out, you know? So um I wanted to ask you on maybe more of a personal level, like you had made the comment earlier about like when you first started, you're working like 90 to 100 hours a week, which is like ridiculous. Like that
Yeah.
is a lot. I used to think I worked a lot in the car industry. That's like a whole nother level of work. So I guess my first question is, are you still working that much now? And when you were working that much, like how did you manage your stress? Or was it just because you were so young, you had all the gas and you're good to go? Like what was that like as far as like, because the way I view that is when you're working that much, people can do it, but it does that's a shorter game versus a longer game, right? Like longevity wise, it's hard to sustain that. So, how did you navigate that journey? Because I'm assuming once you got in and you were doing that, that's probably all you knew as far as being productive and being successful was equating that many hours to it. That's usually what the brain does. But yeah, what was that period like for you? And is it still like that?
Yeah, it's definitely not like that. I mean, uh, it was kind of like an extreme period of life. And, you know, would I want to go back and do that? Probably not, but it was good to experience it at the time because one thing that we were doing, we were compounding time in the sense that we were working multiples the amount that other people were working, and hence we were learning more, experiencing more. Some of it was not intellectual and just like you know like the grunt work that no one else wanted to do. So it wasn't all glorious. But in terms of like our outlets, we were it for my particular cohort when I was first starting, it was all guys. So we were, young, we were in our 20s, and we would work. And if we got off at like 11 p.m., that was like an early night on like Monday to Thursday. So we would actually go out and get drinks and stay up till 2 and then be back in the office at 7:30 or 8 and do it all over
Wow.
again. And that wasn't necessarily like a from a physical healthy perspective, uh, the right path from an outlet perspective, but then that did allow us to kind of blow off steam. And we were in the trenches together, so those late nights we were cracking jokes and doing those things to just try to stay sane in some parts, because some of the demands are just pretty ridiculous and hard to actually conceptualize unless you've actually gone through it.
Gotcha. Okay. And then so I just picture in my head like the finance bros and like I mean like
100%.
exactly what should they talk about on TikTok, right? Like just exactly what that image is. But okay, so then when did that start to transition for you as far as like A, I might physically feel like I can't do it this way anymore, or B, like I also just like don't want to keep going at this pace. And like was that and maybe still is like uh undoing as far as your belief system again, because like one thing I commonly see with my clients is like they only know success on like one way at one speed. And so this idea that and kind of like what you mentioned, like at the beginning, like time is your currency because you're fresh. You don't know a lot. So like that is what you can pay with, right? Okay, I can put in more time, more time, more time. But then eventually that scale should shift if you've done a good job. And now your wisdom and your expertise now starts to take some of that load off. So now you don't have to be as plugged in time wise because you can solve what would have taken you 6 hours before in 30 minutes, right? So what I know with my clients, sometimes it's undoing that a little bit. It's like, hey, you don't need to put in 2 hours of preparation for this anymore. Like literally, like you know it's in you, but it's that inner belief that they're lacking because they've again only seen success one way. And I'm always encouraging them to be like, you can design this how you want to how you can design this the way you want it to look. But again, back to the pattern thing, we have to let go of some of these old patterns, right? So I'm curious, was that an easy transition for you to realize what's more, or maybe family is more important now, or more sleep is more important, or whatever the case is? Or is that still in the back of your mind? Like, I need to put in more time. I need to put in more time.
Yeah, I a couple things to that. I think I've never like shied away from hard work if required. I understand that there's seasons and sometimes you need to gear up a certain part of your life, and inevitably another part takes the back seat for that period of time, right? So that's all. That's about trade-offs, right? Um, but it's interesting because I think in investment banking and wealth management and probably a lot of other careers, you go from like execution to like relationship management or being a producer, right? And I think that is like a very challenging transition for a lot of people to make. And oftentimes organizations are ill-equipped to educate and train and cultivate the type of culture that will lead one person to make that transition to the other sphere, because you are expected to be uh, superior at execution, but then all of a sudden you're supposed to be client facing and bring in business, and it's a whole different skill set, right? um, so I saw it where a lot of people struggled to kind of get to one point to another. They were just like key execution people, and that was like where they were happiest. And it's also the fallacy, I think, of a lot of organizations where they they promote the highest achiever in any kind of group to a managerial position, which they may not be ill suited for, right? So, like the top salesperson will become the manager of sales, the top trader will become, oversee the trading floor, and it's kind of an interesting dynamic where there's people that should probably stick to executing their specialized skill, and then there is people that are well suited to manage people, which is a different skill set. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I thought that just kind of led me to that thought process.
No, that's a really great point because again, it's a conversation I have with my clients often about just like you said, it's a completely different skill set. And so what I often see in my clients again adding to their burnout is they'll still be doing jobs that aren't really the job of the executive or the manager, right? And I respect it because they kind of still want to be on the ground floor with people, like, but you know what? I had to have a conversation with one of my clients and I'm like, that's not a you job anymore. I said, and can you do it? Of course you can. I said, but there's all these other things that would be way more for effective for the business that really only you can execute right now. There's 10 other people that can do that job. You're the only one that can see from this vision level of the company. So like you have to really be strategic and intentional with where you're putting your time and energy. And again, that's an undoing of a pattern in the mind because just like you said, when that's almost like their comfort zone or just what they know so well, it's it again isn't necessarily serving of what the goal is now that they've gotten promoted to this next position. And so it's again just the human brain is so fascinating, right? How we hold on to this stuff so tightly. So yeah, you did take us to a really good point here, but I will touch back on it. Like, how was that transition for you as far as like making that shift? And was there any like kind of mental stories that were always repeating in your mind? Was there any old patterns that were hard to let go of?
Yeah, it was certainly a process. I think inevitably certain life events kind of force you to reprioritize, like, getting married and having kids, and inevitably like life pulls you in different directions, and all of a sudden you don't have the bandwidth or the amount of time that you once did to dedicate to a job, as an example. So you got to figure out how to do things a different way, and it really depends on where your priorities and your values lie, whether you're willing to make those sacrifices. Because certainly there have been people that have prioritized like their careers and their jobs to uh, the I guess the downfall of some of their other areas of their lives, and that's just kind of the way um, it goes, because the priorities and values were different. So I think that is a good compass as it relates to how to allocate your life. And inevitably, you know, the most valuable resource that we have, and as I mentioned, the major determinant in terms of how much risk and what type of risk you can take is time. It's a non-renewable resource. Whether whatever you believe, inevitably, like this life, this type of life is never going to repeat itself as well, right?
Yeah, and it's so true. And going back to what you said about the, the Alex Hormozy example of like, what would your 85-year-old self say to you? I saw someone posted on LinkedIn and they're like, if you need to make a decision, ask like your 85-year-old self and your 9-year-old self and see what the two agree on. And I thought that was so fascinating because neither of them are going to say you need to spend more time in the office. They both of them don't care about that. You know what I mean? Neither of them are like even caring about like what did you hit target or any of that stuff. And like not that we don't want to have goals, but like it does really put into perspective the journey of life as you're saying and how we spend this currency that we can't produce more of. But again, we get stuck in this mind frame of just like, even like I said to you before we got on this call, oh, I'm having camera issues here. Why does it say can't? Sorry, my camera
Okay.
froze now. Okay, we're okay. Um, Going back to what I had said to you before this call started, I was like, I can't believe it's already March. And it's such a human tendency then to be like, oh, have I gotten enough done yet? Like, am I behind schedule? And versus just like taking the moment to appreciate the journey. And it's something I constantly have to remind myself of because again, I don't if I'm talking to my 85-year-old self, I'm sure she's saying like, just get over it. Just keep going. Um, but yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah. I think that reminds me of a quote. I think it's Tony Robbins who says, you often overestimate what you can accomplish in a year, but underestimate what you can accomplish in a decade, right? So for myself, I've been in business for myself for almost 9 years. So ask me in a year and a half, and then I'll see if that rings true or not. So
Well, congrats on that. 9 years in business is no joke. So congrats to you and what you've accomplished so far. And whatever comes down the journey will, I'm sure, be incredible. So um, I have a question for you back to the risk element. Do you have any, I don't know if regret's the word, but is there any risk that you didn't take that you look back on that you wish you would have?
um, yeah, it's one of those things where I'm extremely happy with my life as is right now. So, I've watched the movies like Butterfly Effect with Ashton Kutcher. It's just like mess with one thing, everything goes down the toilet. It but one thing I think would have been cool is I have I was born and raised in Calgary, and I actually have never moved outside of the city. I went for exchange for like 6 weeks in Toronto, but never really lived anywhere else, and that would have been something to experience, and certainly would probably encourage my kids to take advantage of if they ever get the opportunity.
I've thought about that one too, me personally as well, because I've only lived in Edmonton as an adult. I'm from Wainwright originally, which is a small town 2 hours from here. But same thing, I've thought about that, like just how different life could look, and because of like just for immigrant household, right? Like my parents moved from the other side of the world, from a war-torn tropical third world country and landed in Edmonton in November. You know what I mean? Like just like how wildly different the experience is, and just now like never having left, like obviously traveling, but like actually like starting a life in a different area. um but same as you, like I don't regret anything I've done, as far as like I'm really happy with my life now and like where it's led me to. But yeah, it is fascinating because I often think about it even just from like a North American perspective. Like I don't think anywhere else in the world works as much as we do. Like from what I hear, I haven't lived anywhere else, you know what I mean? But like Europe, Asia, all these places, they're not in the grind as much as we are. And it's like, well, they're still all alive and thriving. And I was listening to, I can't remember what podcast it was a little while ago, but they were talking about just doing this study. I think it was on the Diary of a CEO podcast. He was talking to a behavioral analysis expert, I believe, And just this study about how like people who actually live in the city typically are more well off. But studies show that people who live in the country who actually have less financially and materially typically rank higher on the happiness spectrum. And just how a big part of that is the level of connection. And they say people in the city typically, because they have more financial resources, they now have more choice. So he said something as simple as like you go to the movie with your wife and she wants to see a rom-com and you want to see a horror movie, you guys just go, okay, I'll see you when the movie's done. And so now you're not reinforcing that connection together because you have the choice to go to two separate movies and I'll just see you after, right? Where it's like in the country or in more sparse communities, like it's not the same thing. Like you are going to your neighbor for sugar. You know what I mean? If you need someone to check on your kids, like you know, it's just a little bit more tight-knit community, and that connection is what actually supports like where you're ranking on the happiness scale, you know?
Hmm.
And I don't know how I got on this tangent, but I don't know where what led me to this point. Um, but oh, because we were talking about moving to other countries, right? And yeah, anyways, I just think about that a lot about how here we work so much and but whether that's supporting genuine connection or not, I don't know. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry. I went on a whole tangent there after just asking you if there's any risk you regret taking or not taking. So,
It's all good. I like it. Yeah, no, it makes you think though. I mean, it's the society is set up totally differently. I mean, you go to Europe and Asia, it's much South America, it's more family oriented in some ways, like multi-generational family. Like we're very like in North America, like the nuclear family, which I think I heard a stat that only represents like 15% of the population, right? But you know, families look so many different ways, and in other parts of the world, it's not uncommon to have like multiple generations within one household, but our housing and everything isn't structured that way. Our cars and all the things, right? So um, it is interesting, the dream and the structure. It all kind of affects the way we live and work, right?
right. Well, and then even just tying it back to like again our topic of risk taking, like you know, there's so much studies out there from like a relationship standpoint of them saying like if you have a strong relationship, like romantic relationship, husband, wife, marriage, whatever, like you are more likely to take bigger risks because you have that emotional stability at home. Now, of course, that's typically a partnership where the person supports you in what you're doing. But like again, back to Alex Hormozy, like I heard him and Layla talking about how they like took a poll of like all their top executives in their companies, and they said that the executives who had partners at home that were like bought in, like supported them, wore company t-shirts, like just even in the simplest way to what they're doing, their performance was a lot higher than those who didn't. Now that's not to say that people can't still succeed if they're single or whatever the case is, like that's not it at all. But again, it just goes to show that when it comes to taking risks, you do feel a little bit more supported because you know at least because when you think about taking risks, like again, if we're thinking business wise, like obviously there's a financial risk involved, but I think the risk we usually fear is how we're going to feel inside. That fear of failure, that fear of I'm not good enough, like that's usually what we're so adverse to experiencing because that touches the heart, right? That's our center of all of how we live life is how our heart feels. So while of course none of us want to lose a bunch of money or let an investment go wrong or whatever the case is, it's usually more that failure feeling that we're trying to run away from. And it's like at least if you have a support system, whether that be a partner, whether that be your parents, your grandparents, your kid, all in one household, at least you know if something does go quote unquote wrong, you have a support system to fall on, you know? And I know, like, I guess the way I've always witnessed it is with, you know, East Indian families and Asian families, like the generational. It's like usually the grandparents are raising the kids so that the parents can go out and work and make the money, etc., take the risks, quote unquote, but they know their kids are being looked after by people who have a lot of wisdom, who've done it and who have the time and energy now to actually focus on them, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things that I like an example of one of the things that I described as a risk mitigant. I'm sure my wife would not want her to be called a risk mitigant, but it's kind of making the uncertainty more certain because there's support and um, I guess, like you said, you're comforted when you're having a bad day and you made a mistake or a seeming mistake, and then you have a sounding board and you have someone to talk through your decisions with. It goes a long way, right?
Yeah, and like while like yeah, risk mitigant might not be like the sexiest like like partner name, but it's an asset at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Like what an asset for you, and I'm sure vice versa, you for her. So like know you can go home at the end of the day and know that like someone's there to love you regardless of what you accomplish in the world. And again, that can be a partner, that can be a parent, that can be a child,
Hmm.
but just knowing that someone's there to like hold your heart, you know, no matter what happens. And like that alone is, well, that's the driver for all of us is love. That's why we do everything. You know what I mean? Is love and connection. And, you know, because I think like love and respect are interchangeable. Obviously, they kind of have different connotations. But like if you respect someone, I view that as like a version of love. Maybe not intimate love, but like an appreciation, you know? And again, that's the driver for why we do everything in life. So,
Yeah.
you know, and why I always tell people like when you're about to take a leap of faith or maybe take a risk or whatever the case is, it's so important who you surround yourself with because you know the inner dialogue is kind of all that's already enough that you got to battle through, you know what I mean? And so having someone be a soundboard for you, whether that's in a professional sense or a personal sense, like having people that are gonna like be there for you whether it works or doesn't work, is really important during a time like that, right? And if you don't have that in physical people around you, find it in resources. Like there's so much content available now from people who've probably done what you want to do. So put on the Alex Hermosis, put on the Tony Robbins, put on, you know, Brene Brown, like whatever you need for the path that you're on to know that you're not alone because we're human and we've all been through it, you know?
Yeah. I I wanted to like touch on two things that just based off of what you said was one, I have said in the past that having like a stable, solid homestead is like the secret sauce and unlock as it relates to wealth creation and prosperity. So completely agree with you. And whatever that looks like, the family could be your biological or your chosen family. Um, and then uh, I guess secondly, uh, sorry, I just lost that train of thought. So
We were what was I talking about? We were talking about the family unit, we were talking about relationships, who you surround yourself with
yes,
when you're taking a risk.
yeah. I was just gonna say about who you surround yourself with. So I'm sure this is like a common occurrence where you're in a speech, in a sermon, in an environment where someone is telling you something, and you're relating what they're saying to your own personal experiences. So sometimes when you are venturing out and doing something that is different or risky or out there, when you tell people about it, sometimes they're reflecting their own experiences and their own situations and giving you advice or telling you things that may have nothing to do with your specific situation, but more of a reflection of theirs. So that's very important to keep in mind because you don't necessarily want to be dissuaded or discouraged based on those conversations, even if they are with people that love and respect you. It might also be a reflection of their personal situation, reflecting back on what you have said in terms of what you're about to accomplish or do or try, right? So I don't
That's
know
a
if I don't
that's
know
a
if you've
really
experienced.
great point. Yes, yes. Like I'm so glad you mentioned that because it's true. Because like I actually just released an episode yesterday called "Exposure Leads to Expansion," and I was talking about how like exposure can either work for you or against you. Same thing as the patterns, right? So just like you said, you might have people that really care about you, but maybe they haven't walked the path that you're about to walk, or maybe they aren't as experienced or didn't have the same experience you're about to go through, right? Like if I'm being honest, if I'm looking to build wealth, I should listen to you over maybe, my immigrant parents. No knock to them, who came here purely for security, right? Like they came here to escape where they were at and build security, and they did great. But if I'm really trying to build wealth, my mom's always going to just be like, I want to keep you safe. So what do we do to keep you safe? Because she loves me so much, of course. But if I'm coming to you, say, I want to build wealth, you're going to tell me what that requires to do that. Right. And I always tell people, like, if you want to gauge who's the, like, who you should be surrounding yourself with in certain situations, I always go back to who's keeping you small. So like my mom, she loves me. Of course, she just wants me to stay alive, but she's going to keep me in the box she knows me in. You're safe in this box. I got you here. That keeps you alive, but it keeps me in a box. Where you are going to be like, I'm going to push you outside of it. I'm going to push you to grow. I'm going to push your boundaries. I'm going to push your limits a little bit, but like I got you. And so like when you're with whatever type of quote unquote risk you're going to take, or just leap of faith, like gauge it that way. Are these people keeping me small, and they might be very well intentioned in doing so, or is this expanding my growth and my capacity?
Hmm. No, that's cool. Yeah, because I totally relate to that, and it's something that you have to be mindful of, right? Because like everyone always thinks that everyone is thinking about them, where in reality everyone's just thinking about themselves, right?
Yeah, human condition, human nature, right? So anyways, this was a really great episode, Gilbert. I'm so happy we got to dive into it, and I think it's going to be really valuable for people. So, just before we finish up here, do you want to just share a little bit about where people can find you and connect with you, and plug anything that you want to plug?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy to connect with people anywhere and everywhere. My biggest platform is probably LinkedIn, so you could just find me as Gilbert Bong, and uh, our business is Zelos Investment Council, so www.zelosglobal.com. Happy to connect, and if there's any way that I can help or assist, I'm willing and able to do so.
Amazing. And I'll make sure I get those and put them in the show notes links as well. So if you guys don't remember it, just go click there and you can connect with Gilbert. So awesome. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode.